Well, good evening. I had this message prepared a few weeks ago, but through various events, my message here was postponed a few times. But the past couple of days, I was meditating on it just to make sure this is what the Lord wanted me to speak on tonight. But I often find that the Lord sometimes speaks to me through lyrics of songs. I usually throughout the day I'm singing various songs, and sometimes they just pop into my spirit, and I just go about my day. But other times there's songs that just kind of keep coming to my spirit over and over again, and that's usually when I decide to stop and pay attention to what they're saying or what the Lord might be speaking to me. And as I was preparing for this message, which it also happened to be a little similar to a message that I gave in Scotia, but the song that the Lord was speaking to me was "Little is Much When God is in It." And I think most of you may be familiar with it, but I just want to read a couple of the lyrics here. "In the harvest field now ripened, there is a work for all to do. Hark, the Master's voice, it's calling, to the harvest calling you. Does the place you're called to labor seem so small and little known? Well, it is great if God is in it, and he will not forsake his own. Little is much when God is in it. Labor not for wealth or fame. There's a crown, and you can win it if you go in Jesus' name." Now, the part that was speaking to me was just little is much if God is in it. And as I was meditating on it, I was thinking of different examples in the Bible of when little was much. And there are many examples, and I'm not going to do an extensive study, but just a few of them that I was thinking about. The first one was the widow and her mite. If we want to look at Mark chapter 12, verses 41 to 44, Mark chapter 12, verses 41 to 44. "And Jesus sat over against the treasury and beheld how the people cast money into the treasury, and many that were rich cast in much. And there came a certain poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites, which make a farthing. And he called unto him his disciples, and saith unto them, Verily I say unto you, that this poor widow hath cast in more than all they which hath cast into the treasury. For all they did cast in of their abundance, but she, of her want, did cast in all that she had, even all her living." Now here's an example of a small act by a poor widow woman, right? She was being faithful to give of her little income. And it was such a meaningful moment that Jesus took note of it. He called his disciples over and showed it to them. He said, take note of this widow woman. She cast more in than everybody else did of their abundance because she gave all that she had, even though it was a little. It's a small moment and so insignificant maybe at that time, and yet it was so significant to Jesus that he called his disciples over to show them, and not only that, but it ended up in the scriptures where we can read about it today. This small moment has now been passed down through generations and generations the whole world over, and it will continue on for more generations to come. It was a small act, but God was paying attention to her heart. He saw that she gave of the abundance of what she had. And sometimes I think, we may feel pressured at times, a good pressure, but we may feel pressured to do certain acts of kindness or to give of what we have because we know people are watching. Well, I see this need here and everybody's watching, so I should probably do something about it because, it'll look bad if I don't. And while it may end with a good result, you did help out, what was your motivation? Were you doing it because other people were watching you? Were you doing it because you wanted to be praised? Wow, look at how much they gave, or look how kind they were. A small little pet peeve that I've developed is sometimes when I watch videos on YouTube, I see these grand acts of generosity, and while in and of themselves they're great. It's nice to see people doing kind acts for other people, finding somebody on the street, giving them $100 or feeding them. But the part that bothers me is the fact that it was recorded, usually by themselves. So if you think about it, this person, they had this idea, I want to do something really kind, but I want to make sure everybody knows about it. So if you think about the whole process, they had to get out their phone, set it up at a good angle, on the tripod or a good position, went out, did their act of kindness, shared $100 with somebody, paid their bills or whatever, which is a good act, and I'm sure it benefited them greatly. It was a wonderful act. I'm sure that it was generous. But then go back to your phone, stop recording, edit it, add some dramatic music, type up the description, and then post it so that everybody can see. They can get likes and comments, and everybody can see what a wonderful thing they did. And it's a pet peeve of mine because what is their motivation behind it? I'm not against the act of kindness that they did, but what kind of irritates me is the whole process that they went to make sure that everybody noticed it. Okay, you did good. All right, thank you for that. But what is our motivation when we do small or big acts of kindness or generosity? When we're putting in offerings, when we're helping somebody out, what is our motivation? Little is much when God is in it. And if we look at Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 to 24, Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 to 24. Servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. And whatsoever ye do, do it heartily as to the Lord, and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ. So you could do acts of kindness and you could reap your reward here, or you could do a silent act of kindness and reap a greater reward in heaven, right? Next story that I want to look at, where little is much, is the story of David and Goliath. Another story we're all very familiar with. Only a boy named David, only a little sling, only a boy named David, only a rippling brook, only a boy named David, but 5 little stones he took. You can tell that I work with kids because every story that I go through, a song would pop into my head. But just think about that. Only a boy named David. And here he was, he stepped up and he volunteered himself. He was only a boy. He wasn't even old enough to be part of the army. All of his brothers were there as part of the army. He was back at home taking care of, the sheep and everything, and he was only there to check on his brothers, bring them food, and see how things were going. And here he found out, this massive giant has been taunting them for 40 days, and nobody has stepped up to volunteer to defeat this giant. And he's just this small boy, and yet he had such great faith. He knew that the Lord was on their side. So I'm sure he was very well aware of the differences in their stature. He's very well aware he's just a little boy, and Goliath is this massive giant. And yet that didn't faze him. He knew that God was on their side. So little is much when God is in it. And he decided to step forward. Well, nobody else is stepping forward, so I'm going to do it. He could be very well within his rights to say, well, I'm just a boy. I'm not even part of the army, right? I don't need to overstep my bounds, but he saw that there was a need. Nobody was filling it, and he presented himself. And if we look at 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, but the Lord said unto Samuel, look not at his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. And now here, only a boy named David, he presented himself to King Saul, and even Saul was a little suspicious, like, I don't know if, this is a right idea, but, he's a little short on volunteers, so we got to use what we have available. And he tried to fit him with his armor. Well, at least go out with my armor, right? At least, pretend you're protected, or, at least try to look like you're intimidating. And when he tried on somebody else's armor, it didn't fit. It wasn't going to work, right? God had given David his own abilities, his own stature, and he wanted to use David just as he was. David was not intended to use somebody else's abilities, somebody else's armor. God gave David exactly what he needed to use in him. And that happened to be 5 smooth stones and a sling, right? Our physical limitations are nothing compared to what God can do when we present them to his hands. Sometimes, just like in the story, the Goliath was taunting them for 40 days. And sometimes there's that awkward pause when we feel drawn to do something. There's a little hesitation. Should I give this prophecy? Should I call up that person? I never talk to them, but for some reason I feel like I should call them out of the blue. It seems kind of strange, but I feel like I need to call them. Or, that stranger over there, I just really feel compelled to witness to them. And God is giving you that chance. But there's a limited amount of time before you either act on it or you don't. And God will either use you as you are, or he will move on and he will use somebody else instead. So your job is to come and present yourself with what God has given you, and he will take care of the rest. The next story I want to look at is the feeding of the 5,000, and also the 4,000, but mainly the feeding of the 5,000. Another story that we're all very familiar with. And I'm going to read John chapter 6, verses 5 through 13. John chapter 6, verses 5 through 13. And I'll try to go through this really quickly, but I want to get the story fresh in our minds here. When Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him, he said unto Philip, Whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? And this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Jesus already knew what he was going to do, okay? He may have asked him, what are we going to do to feed all these people? But he was asking to prove them, to see what they would say, what they would do. But Jesus already knew what he was going to do, okay? Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said unto him, There is a lad here which have 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. But what are they among so many? And Jesus said, Make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down, in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples. And the disciples to them that were set down, and likewise to the fishes, as much as they would. When they were filled, he said unto his disciples, Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Therefore they gathered them together and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves which remained over, and above unto them that had eaten. Now God was going to feed these 5,000 people regardless, right? As it said, God knew what he was going to do. He was going to feed them. He wasn't going to let them go starving. But what if this little boy was too shy to speak up and offer his loaves and fishes? God was still going to do a miracle, but that little boy wouldn't have been a part of that story. It would have been somebody else or something else, right? That little boy had brought a lunch that day, not really thinking anything about it. Probably his mom packed it for him. He went on his merry little way, just thinking, it's going to be a little snack that he's going to eat for the day. Not really thinking anything of it. He didn't know how it could be used to feed so many, and yet he had faith and believed in Jesus. He saw there was a problem. There was people that need to be fed. He saw that he had food. Maybe it was just barely enough to feed one person, but he had food. He didn't know how Jesus was going to use it, but he presented it and offered it to Jesus to do what he wanted to do. It wasn't his job. It wasn't the little boy's job to figure out how it was going to be used, right? It's not his job to do that. It was his job to present it to Jesus and let Jesus do what he wanted with it. And he presented it with a faithful heart. Jesus blessed the food and gave thanks. And not only did he feed everyone, but there were leftovers. There was more leftovers than what they originally started out with. And if you think about that, without the faith of this little boy, he would have missed out on a great blessing there. Now let's think about this story in another way. What if the boy saw that there was a need, people needed to eat and he had food, but instead of presenting it to Jesus, he just decided to offer it himself. Well, I have food, I'll just come over here. I don't need to go up in front, to give it to Jesus. I'll just share it myself. As I'd mentioned, it was probably barely enough just for one person, let alone to be shared with somebody else. So that's an example of something that was little, that would remain little unless it went through Jesus' hands. We can have gifts, we can have offerings, we can have things that we want to share, but unless we allow those gifts to be used through Jesus' hands, they will remain little. They will remain insignificant. They will not go very far. And so I think it's an example to show us that, God has given us something, but it's also our job to give it back to him. He wants us to willingly and faithfully and freely give it back to him so that he can bless it and that he can multiply even more with it. Right. It's not always our job to figure out how God is going to use our talents and resources, but it is our job to faithfully present them to be used for his glory. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10, as every man hath received the gift, even so minister the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. We are all given talents, special abilities, and they all may look different, but it's our responsibility to use them and use them through Jesus. I'm going to just touch on one more story. The oil that never ran dry. And I know it's a Wednesday night, so I'm not going to read another big section, but the story of the widow Zarephath, in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 7 through 16. I'm not going to read it, but I'm just putting it out there for your reference. But just to summarize it, there's a severe drought, and the prophet Elijah had asked an impoverished widow to share her last meal with him. She only had a handful of flour and a little bit of oil left, but God had commanded Elijah to specifically travel there and told him that he had commanded a widow to provide him with food. Now, when he met her, she was gathering a couple sticks and she was preparing her final meal for her and her son. And she was planning on just making this meal and probably dying after that. This is their last meal. She doesn't have anything left. But Elijah asked her to make a meal for him first. How would you feel about that? Somebody coming over to your house, you're preparing to make your last meal, and somebody says, why don't you make me food first, and then we'll worry about you and your son later. I don't know. I might have a little difficulty complying right away, but but she was faithful. She was faithful, and she did prepare a meal for Elijah. And because of that faithfulness, because she was obedient, Elijah gave her a promise that her flour and oil will not run dry until the rains came. Because of her act of obedience, she had to act in obedience first. He didn't promise first, well, if you make me this meal, I promise, it's never going to run dry. Or, I'll give you the promise first and then you make me the food. Or, why don't you make your food first and then, God will bless us. There was a process there. God was trying her and testing her faithfulness and her willingness to submit to this prophet who came by. And because she was willing, God decided to bless her. And in fact, actually, if you read further on, we find out that her son became sick and was actually dying, but because of this connection that she had the ability to plead with Elijah and say, my son is dying. Was there anything that you can do to save him? And he was able to plead with Jesus over his life, and he was healed. And so the blessings compounded. Not only did God bless her with her provisions, but he even blessed her by healing her son because of her faithfulness. So, little acts of kindness can tend to snowball in ways that we may not even expect down the road, and we may not even see it right away until later on. But just like the parable of the sower, it's our purpose and our job and our responsibility to cast our seed among all grounds. It's our job. We have something precious that we need to share, regardless of how it's received, right? It's our responsibility to cast it among, and it will be cast among different types of ground, just as the parable of the sower. Some are going to be thorny or dry, but some are going to be on fertile ground, and you just never know. But it's your job to be faithful and sow the seed. And not necessarily with the motivation of, wanting to be praised or expecting to see the fruit right away. Sometimes we may not even see the benefit of what we've done, even in this lifetime. We may not even find out until, we're in heaven. But rest assured that it will be accomplished according to God's plan. God has given us each individual talents and skills, blessings, burdens, abilities. He has given something to every one of us, and we are to present them to Jesus to be used as he sees fit for his glory. In Isaiah chapter 55, verse 11, Isaiah 55, verse 11, "So shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereunto I sent it." God's word will not return void. He has a plan for everything. And as I mentioned before, if we put it in his hands, it will be multiplied. If we try to do it in our own will, in our own plan, in our own eyes, the way we think, God has given me this ability, and I think this is how I should use it because I think this is what makes the most sense. You could do that, but it's not going to be very profitable. Your reward is just going to be that. That's it. But if we are faithful to that little still small voice that we hear when God tells us, I think you should do this. And sometimes it's not always easy. Sometimes it's a little uncomfortable or difficult. But if we're faithful and we put it in God's hands and say, all right, Lord, I will be faithful to what you're calling me to. I put it in your hands. He will bless it and he will multiply it. That's his job. That's not your job. And I just want to conclude with one last verse from that song, Little is Much. "And when the conflict here has ended and our race on earth is run, he will say, if you've been faithful, welcome home, my child, well done." And we want to hear those words, amen, from Matthew 25, verse 21. "Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord." Amen. Amen.